of knowledge. Thank you very much. I wish to also acknowledge the moderator and our esteemed panelists that will be able really to ensure that we leave this gathering more endowed with knowledge and appreciation of our common responsibility and roles to construct a better Africa and the world. I wish to acknowledge the Ambassador of the State of Eritrea, also the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Omar Abdu. Thank you very much for gracing us here today. And thank you very much to our heads of missions resident in South Africa that I see here, particular ambassadors and high commissioners present. The recipient of the Oliver Tambo Ubuntu Award for Diplomacy, Ambassador Nhlapo, which is also the UNISA Ambassador in Residence. Ambassador DIRCO, formerly Ambassador at Large at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, now Ambassador of UNISA in Residence. This is quite innovative, Professor, to take some of the total sum of international diplomatic experience and locate them at UNISA. And it should be accolades for the fact that women in academia has always proven to have a particular pedigree of foresight, which ordinarily have not been found elsewhere. So this type of quite innovative decision making, I suppose in the near future you will see it being multiplied elsewhere in South Africa, because if I was a vice chancellor, surely I'll follow into your footsteps. Intelligentsia of both UNISA and elsewhere, and international IR students and scholars being present here. I wish to acknowledge members of the South African Foreign Service, represented by the lead delegation, Mr. Lahir, from Global Governance and Multilateralism. I wish to acknowledge the student body, in particular the Deputy Secretary General of the National Student Representative Council, Ms. Mochawi. Ladies and gentlemen, Nelson Mandela in 1998, on the occasion of the 53rd convening of UNGA in New York in the US, stated the following, and I quote, "In reality, there is no rational answer that can be advanced to explain in a satisfactory manner what in the end is the consequence of Cold War inertia and an attachment to the use of the threat of brute force to assert the primacy of some states over others," unquote. On this day, ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago, the world bared witness to its darkest scientific achievement, the atomic bomb of Hiroshima. And exactly 72 hours later, Nagasaki was also bombed. Those blasts did not merely destroy cities, it ruptured the consciousness of humanity. Today, on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, and also as we celebrate the 80 years of the foundation of the UN, we are called, ladies and gentlemen, to not just remember, but also to act and to deeply reflect on the progress made in the progressive realization of the global nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament legislative and policy architecture. Equally so, we should also confront the challenges, the accompanying weaknesses, and threats that continue to define the nuclear disarmament regime. Therefore, this particular seminar jointly hosted by UNISA and DIRCO should not merely be to engage on ideological and academic clarity, ladies and gentlemen, but we should also use this as an opportunity to interrogate the powers at play. We are assembled in the presence of a daily unfortunate expansion of genocide in Palestine, in particular in the city of Gaza. And we are bearing witness, ladies and gentlemen, of wars and conflicts raging in Ukraine, Sudan, and Syria, amongst others. It is my submission that it feels, ladies and gentlemen, at times that the silence of global governance is actually louder than the cries of the victims itself. In these conflicts, the architecture of peace built after World War II seems to be increasingly fragile and seems actually to be fracturing. The UN, ladies and gentlemen, was born in the ruins of war to ensure, as its central and key mandate, the maintenance of peace and security architecture through cooperation. In its very first UNGA resolution, Resolution 1, subsection 1 of 1946, it therefore called with nobility and clarity for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years after that very noble calling, the elimination of nuclear weapons has not taken place. It not only remains in existence, but it's more modernized. It is deployed in hardened bunkers. It is whispered, ladies and gentlemen, in the strategic doctrines of nuclear armed states, who also simultaneously claim moral and ethical authority. At the center of the global nuclear regime stands the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Adopted, ladies and gentlemen, in 1968 and entering into force in 1970. Unfortunately, the NPT is perceived by many in the global south as a key treaty, ladies and gentlemen, that requires collaboration from, in particular, the P5 member states of the UNSC, who all of those 5 states, ladies and gentlemen, are recognized as nuclear weapon states, whilst there's a concurrent responsibility and expectation that all other nation states should forego nuclear weapons in exchange for the promise of disarmament and access to peaceful nuclear energy. Today, nearly every member of the UN, 191 countries, ladies and gentlemen, has joined the NPT. However, 3 states, India, Pakistan, and the state of Israel, has never signed it. North Korea did, ladies and gentlemen, but withdrew in 2003. These 4 countries all possess, therefore, nuclear weapons, with the state of Israel maintaining a policy of strategic ambiguity, despite a growing historical body of evidence of undeclared nuclear arsenal. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, whilst the NPT signatories are all routinely scrutinized and penalized, we have seen that the state of Israel's nuclear status remain largely unchallenged, protected by the veil of Western geopolitical alliances. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, it is our submission as South Africa that this type of multilateral double standards strikes at the very center of the credibility of the NPT. For many in the global south, an important but difficult question is why should we, as the international community, demand non-proliferation from some whilst rewarding, ladies and gentlemen, impunity from others? How do we reconcile the call for restraint in the global south whilst NATO states shelter under nuclear umbrellas and modernize their arsenals? This, ladies and gentlemen, is hypocrisy and double standards. South Africa's own experience stand as an example of moral authority, and importantly, ladies and gentlemen, it stands as a moral compass to the world today. We do remind heads of missions present that we did possess the nuclear weapons, and we voluntarily, ladies and gentlemen, dismantled our nuclear arsenal. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what we are calling for on all member states of the United Nations is to act with conviction when we speak about moral leadership that must be provided to the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state after dismantling our nuclear weapons arsenal. We further played a pivotal role through the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, commonly known as the Pelindaba Treaty, and we supported, ladies and gentlemen, through our conviction, the work of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. And I should remind everyone that we were amongst the first 50 states to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which entered into force, ladies and gentlemen, in January 2021. Ambassador Nhlapo, we are honored to serve as South Africa as the elected president of the TPNW and will preside over its first review conference in 2026. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 5 decades, the NPT has arguably helped to prevent the rapid proliferation of nuclear weapons. It did play a pivotal role in limiting the number of nuclear-armed states far below the initial predictions which was made in 1960. Dozens of countries, ladies and gentlemen, that once pursued or considered nuclear weapons programs such as Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, and Libya eventually abandoned these pursuits, in part due to the normative weight and institutional mechanism which the NPT framework provided. The International Atomic Energy Agency, created in 1957 and strengthened through the role assigned to it by the NPT, has become a pivotal institution in the verification and compliance regime. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, the NPT has given birth to an interlocking network of norms and treaties that encapsulate today's disarmament architecture. These include the Comprehensive Nuclear Ban Treaty, the CTPTO, which obviously, ladies and gentlemen, has as its key steward the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, ladies and gentlemen, is pivotal quite essential. It has not as yet entered into force. It has established a near global norm against nuclear testing. The Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, and the multiple regional nuclear weapon-free zone treaties in Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific has all, ladies and gentlemen, been instruments that have helped the embedment of the disarmament regime in a very complex legal and policy fabric of international relations. And it is my submission that evidently, ladies and gentlemen, it has been able to build a very solid foundation that will lead to the eventual abolition. Additionally, ladies and gentlemen, we have seen a number of international and civil society-led initiatives, such as the Humanitarian Initiative, the Vienna process, and the ICANN-led movement that culminated in the actual adoption of the TPNW in 2017. Those efforts reflect a shift in the global consensus, ladies and gentlemen. There is a shift, and there's acknowledgement that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons render their continued existence morally untenable and legally indefensible. Despite this, we are bearing witness today of a quiet arms race. Nuclear armed states are not disarming, they are upgrading, they are modernizing. Doctrines are shifting from deterrence to warfighting scenarios. Military budgets are ballooning, and the non-nuclear majority of the world, especially countries of the global south, are once again asked to trust a system that marginalizes our voice and risks our common future. The NPT, ladies and gentlemen, is therefore in danger of a credibility crisis, not because of its spirit, nor because of its principles, but because its implementation has been selectively enforced. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our submission that non-nuclear states are complying in full, but we have seen that nuclear weapon states reinterpret, delay, or dilute their full commitments to the NPT. The 11th review conference of the NPT, to be held in 2026, ladies and gentlemen, must be a turning point. If not, the erosion of trust in the NPT as a treaty may become irreversible. Ladies and gentlemen, we should carefully straddle the debate on the myth that exists that the NPT and the TPNW are mutually exclusive. It is not. The TPNW fills a critical legal and moral gap by explicitly prohibiting the development, the testing, the possession, and the use of nuclear weapons. It stigmatizes, importantly, what should have never been normalized, and it reaffirms the unalienable right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy as outlined in Article 4 of the NPT, a right that many in the global south find increasingly constrained by restrictive export controls, politicized approvals, and discriminatory standards. South Africa will therefore continue to advocate for a nuclear-free world, not only, ladies and gentlemen, because it's just and it's based on social justice, but because it is a necessary condition for the prolonged life of us as a world. Ladies and gentlemen, we are mindful that nuclear weapons do not exist in isolation. They are linked to consequent of global inequality, unilateralism in particular, to extend the life of militarism, and to divert resources away from development, health, and education. We are mindful, ladies and gentlemen, that when NATO states start to strive towards a 6% spending on military budgets, its ability to provide leadership to the attainment of your SDG goals becomes then a distant reality. It's therefore, ladies and gentlemen, our submission that we stand at the critical conjuncture. We have seen and we have witnessed the erosion of international law. We have seen the increase and enhanced nuclear posturing, strategic escalation in the Indo-Pacific, and the complete disregard for ordinary human life, including women and children, in Palestine. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, Africa has increasingly been bearing witness and experiencing the heartache of wars and conflicts, which often, ladies and gentlemen, are fueled by both state and non-state actors with a particular foreign interest. We therefore cannot continue as South Africa to remain silent. We'll continue to champion, ladies and gentlemen, what is right, what is just, through our very steadfast conviction that Africa's own prosperity is linked to its peace and security architecture, and that our peace and security architecture, ladies and gentlemen, has a relationship with the peace and security architecture as espoused by the United Nations through the UNSC. We therefore use this as an opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to call on our partners within the international community to continue to champion the change that is required in the UN Security Council. In particular, ladies and gentlemen, that the discussions and the debate about the presence of Africa, the use and the continued existence of the veto vote is a matter that we should continue to champion if we want to guarantee a world that are free from masculine, temperamental, political decision making. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, let me start where I began, in Hiroshima. The survivors, called the Iwakusha, have spent their entire lives and generations are bearing witness of the unfortunate, unjust consequence utilization of nuclear arms against humanity. We must therefore, ladies and gentlemen, today honor them not only with words, but with concrete and decisive action. We need to concretely discuss ways to dismantle the architecture of nuclear hypocrisy. Ladies and gentlemen, the NPT recognizes the existence of two classes of states: nuclear weapon states and nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, each with their own rights and obligations under the NPT. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, We are looking forward with anticipation on the panel discussion so that we are able to better understand and appreciate the concept of common but differentiated responsibility existing within the MPT regime. Common responsibility to reduce the risk of nuclear use, common responsibility to engage in disarmament efforts in good faith, common responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, to build trust, and common responsibility to provide assurances to other states about intentions. States therefore have common but differentiated responsibility around nuclear weapons, including for nuclear risk reduction, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Leadership, ladies and gentlemen, comes with responsibility. Many wish to lead, but few are able to provide leadership. I wish you well. Thank you very much.